Thank you, Anthony, and good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to acknowledge the previous sessions, and I guess my role today is to bring a lot of that together and crystallise it for you. I guess the first critical thing is, let me ask you a couple of questions. How many of you can remember when we were a country of 3 to 3.5 million people? Even more recently, when we were 4 million. That was about 16 years ago. Only 16 years ago, we got 1 million people within New Zealand in the last 16 years, because we hit 5 million during lockdown, and a team of 4 million became a team of 5 million. How many of you thought in the last couple of years the country seemed a little bit more full than what the population projections were telling us? If you thought that, you're actually right. The basis on which we plan, fund and execute infrastructure is based entirely on population projections in one form or another, and that basis for planning and funding is failing us. It's failed planners because what it means is you're constantly chasing your tail, trying to keep up. It's failed constructors because you're actually fighting for a smaller slice of the development pie than what you would have otherwise have had. And it's failed the politicians because it means you can't execute some of the growth strategies that you're trying to come into office to do. So what I want to do today is show you the now. How the hell did we get here? But I'm not going to spend too much time on the now, because that's where we are. We can't change it. Then moving through to the next. And again, that's something we can't significantly change, but what's in store for us. And then the beyond, which is how do we move and how do we fund and take control of our destiny going forward. So firstly, how do we get here? Why are all the pressures that people were talking about in the previous sessions so confronting for us? How did the world become so risky when actually we were playing it reasonably safe? Right now we're a country of just over 5 million people. Our growth has been accelerating through a combination of net migration and a larger base for births. But here's the thing, if you look at those graphs in there, we hit 5 million people almost 10 years faster than what we thought we were going to do back in 2006. And almost 2 years faster than the forecast back in 2013, which is our last available large-scale population forecast. Now, if you think about the context of that, that's even with the 2013 figures, that's tens of thousands more households travelling, using schools, hospitals, tens of thousands more than we thought we were going to have. In terms of the next 5 to 7 years, that looks great from an infrastructure perspective in many respects. In Auckland, we get the City Rail Link and the National Convention Centre will have transformed the waterfront for the America's Cup. Wellington gets Transmission Gully, maybe a new Civic Square precinct and possibly a convention centre. Christchurch will have the Metro Sports Centre and maybe the new multi-use arena might be finished by then. And as Robert indicated earlier, there's a pile of shovel-ready projects that are going to transform the regions. But here's the thing. We aren't building or funding these things fast enough to keep pace with our growth. We're not just sprinting to stay still, we're going backwards. And we're going backwards because we're failing to anticipate growth. And we're failing to realise that our population actually dynamically adjusts to the infrastructure investment we're making. I'll use one example around this, which is Transmission Gully. Transmission Gully starkly shows this dynamic, and these are the population projections and the actuals. It's not even open yet, but households and businesses have already banked on that change and they've moved. They've moved to the Kapiti Coast and they've moved much further up the line in the Horowhenua. They've responded to that investment combined with the Kapiti Expressway. And here's the interesting thing. They don't even seem to have come from the south in Wellington, which is still growing significantly ahead of those population projections. Transmission Gully isn't isolated. Almost every project we've planned and funded in the last 20 years, we've got wrong on its demand. It's 2 to 10 years in terms of that figure up there. Doesn't look like much, but if you go back to the business cases and you look, these business cases are planned on a 30 to 40 year analysis period. If we're 10 years out on our population projections, we're potentially underestimating the value to users of these projects by anywhere up to 25%. Underestimating the value of our investments means that projects are less likely to get to yes, even with existing funding. Underestimating the value of our investments actually makes it harder to get new funding. And I think, Council talked about that earlier on. And underestimating the value of our investments ultimately means we're getting less built than we should do. And I'll touch on more on value in a moment, because that's a critical underpinning of how we actually fund for the future. One of the other issues is we can't get ahead because our funding models are often failing to recognise dynamic behavioural changes in families, property developers, users of services and things like that. They're also failing to keep pace with technology change. I'll show you as two examples, two of our largest funding sources for infrastructure, fuel and rates. So if we look at fuel for a minute, transport's great because it's almost entirely based on users. Users are funding transport services through fuel excise duty, road user charges and things like that. So doesn't that automatically control for not getting our population right? Not when a large part of your revenue per use is based on the efficiency of the vehicle. And you can see here how much less a taxi driver pays compared to 15 years ago, using a Commodore, which was a standard taxi 15 years ago, versus a 2020 Prius. And that's through technology change and dynamic consumer behaviour. There are 7,000 registered taxis in New Zealand. Rates in long-term council planning is absolutely hampered by population forecasting. And Tauranga is a really interesting one if you look at how fast Tauranga has grown compared to the population projections that absolutely underpinned a lot of the long-term planning that's going through. So that kind of approach, the forecasting, represents a challenge to you as central and local government officials, advisors, funders and constructors. We're getting it wrong all the time. And I guess looking at these graphs and things, it just illustrates the point. It doesn't actually change anything. The point is, I guess, is can we afford to keep making the mistakes we've been making? The last three sessions absolutely reinforced that question for me. So a critical part of the next, and my challenge to you, is how do we start thinking about planning and funding for a country of 6 million people in terms of our infrastructure and in terms of what we need? And we're in a room full of infrastructure people, so I'm not going to ask you, and we're not going to have a poll about whether you think more infrastructure is the answer, because obviously we'll get the right answer there. But let's start by asking the question about when do you think we're going to hit 6 million people? When do you think we might get there, and over what time period? Bear in mind, 6 million people is a country that is 20% larger in population than what it is today. Does COVID give us some breathing space? Well, we've had 70,000 net migration in the year to August, and over 60,000 New Zealanders returning since March. And if you saw the Kia survey last week, over 500,000 New Zealanders overseas, based on that survey, are looking at returning to New Zealand in the short to medium term. So it's quite possibly COVID might give us some breathing space, but it may not ultimately solve the issue. The last best estimate we have from Stats New Zealand was in 2013 that said we'd hit 6 million people by 2046. But think about the last 20 years. We got to our last million people, we got from 4 to 5 million people in 16 years. So my question to you at the moment is, what if we've only got 16 years to invest and fund infrastructure that not only needs to provide for the future, but also needs to catch up to the present? So in terms of the beyond, can we actually afford to start making some mistakes we've not been making? And because we've been making a lot of mistakes previously. How do we fund it? Well, I guess the first question, and it's been touched on by the previous users, is I'm not actually going to go into the funding toolbox because the funding toolbox is full. Everybody's been talking about that in the last couple of sessions. It's full of things that we know work, that have good track records. So let's not dwell on that. If the toolbox is full to meet the challenges, then where's the problem? We're making material progress, as a number of the panellists said in the last couple of sessions. But it also, the immediate consequences of having a discussion around dipping into the funding toolbox are real. There are votes lost, there's disagreement, there's conflict, there's stress. The bottom line is for all of us is there's never a good time to reach into the toolbox, even for a little tinker. So we kick the problems down the road, and as Tembi Powell said earlier, kick it down a potholed road, and we wait for the political and policy cycles to align. But if our country is 20% bigger within 16 years, do we actually have time for those political and policy cycles to align? By allowing those cycles to dictate action, you're effectively pushing out the funding problem by 5 to 7 years. That's a safe decision for the now, but for the next and the beyond, we're 45% of the way towards an extra million users, and we're still debating additional infrastructure funding. So what's the answer? Our history of change in this country gives us a great 3-step strategic blueprint, and I'm going to make an apology in advance for the 1990s motivational slide posters that I'm about to put through. They will be on sale in the EY office later. The first is to have the courage to set the strategy. Second is have the nerve to hold the course even when times get tough, although some pragmatic tinkering is allowed. And the third is have the awareness to consolidate the gains, whatever they are, once you pull through it. This is actually the strategy that we've used in our COVID response. And it's also Sweden's strategy. Even though they had a completely different COVID response, they adopted the same basic principles. In fact, those that failed with their COVID were the ones that didn't hold their nerve. We have also adopted the same strategy to respond to the GFC and the Canterbury earthquakes. And you've seen aspects of that with the last few panellists that have been going through in different ways. They've been talking about courage and nerve and so on. But what I've done right now is pretty easy. I've observed 20 years of hard work, a little bit of luck and some very good advice, and absorbed it into 3 glib statements. Too often, infrastructure at the project or program level, we let funding be somebody else's problem. We have our default sources of taxes and rates, and we don't depart from that. It means that at the project and program level, you just have to win the internal competition to show that your project is more worthy of funding than another one. But what that means in reality is we never actually grow the funding pie, no matter how good the investments are. So how can you turn that into action? Firstly, I'd like each of you to think about outcomes that we seek from infrastructure, from our cities and our regions, and ask 2 questions. Who benefits from what value does the infrastructure create, and who benefits from that value? And I'll give you a really good example. Ken Livingstone, when he was running for Mayor of London, ran on a platform of 10 outcomes for Londoners. Do you want better public transport? Safer places to walk and cycle? Do you want cleaner air? He never actively campaigned on the congestion charge, yet that was the tool he used to deliver the outcomes that Londoners signed up for. The political economy of that's undeniable and embraces a proud pragmatism, but it's a totally different way to how we plan and fund infrastructure in New Zealand. Our evaluation approach in business cases focuses on fixing problems, and in many cases you have to wait for the problems to get so bad you have no other choice but to invest. You've not actually made anybody's lives better under this approach. You're just minimising the damage caused by years it took you to do something. So it's no wonder, with so little value created, people aren't willing to have a discussion about whether they're willing to pay more for their infrastructure. The focus on building for and then funding for value, even if it's only partly contributes to the cost, changes that dynamic. It's a relentlessly positive approach. You still have to do the basics right, but you create something that stands on its own as an investable proposition, not taking any traditional funding for granted. It's not a major pivot in many respects. The value is already there. And going back to some previous commentators, whilst growth does not pay for growth, it's still an absolutely critical part, because without growth, everything gets harder to fund. So it's an absolutely critical benchmark. So investing in growth is absolutely critical. At the macro level, if the country becomes more efficient and productive due to large-scale infrastructure investments, the additional revenue gained is readily quantifiable. At the local level, these projects change communities. They change lives. They create accessibility or new community facilities, and they affect property values. Better services change people's willingness to pay, either directly or indirectly. The bottom line is, funding isn't someone else's problem that's resolved at the political level or by small groups of people in the Treasury or Council CFO offices. Those macro settings that those people are concerned about will shift, but 20 years of experience shows us they won't shift fast enough to prepare us for the future. We need to complement that with a more aggressive approach to funding at the project and program level in a way that supports more sustainable investment, because our highest value projects will start to grow the funding pie instead of just being at the front of the queue for the existing funding. The value is all around us, and it's associated with growth. And if each of you who are looking at projects and programs at the moment leave here and go back and calculate that value and articulate it to users in the community of your projects, you will within a short time have advanced analysis independent of the default funding approaches that have got us into the problems that we face now. You'll have positioned your project and your program for its next stages in a way that demonstrably is more resilient, with more pathways to getting to yes. And beyond that, we've collectively created a platform for action to generate accelerated and funded infrastructure in a way that delivers for a country of 6 million people.